I believe we are there. Are you seeing my screen now, Glenn, and everyone
I
else?
am.
Excellent. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you, Dan and Glenn, both for your kind introduction. Do forgive Dan for that lengthy biography he posted. I found it somewhat embarrassing. I gave him 3 sentences and that should have done. Suffice it to say, I love what I do. I've been doing this quite a while, and instrument flying is a major love of mine. So let's jump right into the presentation here. And I'm not, oh, here we go. Okay. So the rule of primacy, this is where I'm going to start. The rule of primacy, and I think we're all familiar with it, is the things we learn first are the things that stick with us. And there are also the hardest things to unlearn. Now, because we're not live and I don't have the wherewithal to find out about all of you who are here attending, and I'd be curious to know, is there anyone who is not an instrument rated pilot? Are you working on the instrument rating? Or are you perhaps just a VFR pilot interested in attitude flying, which is wonderful. And I'm glad you're here if that is the case. The fact of the matter is, though, that all of us learned a little bit about instrument attitude flying when we were student pilots. I don't know why I'm not advancing. Here we go. So, when does the typical pilot first get introduced to instrument attitude flying? As student pilots. Every one of us learned a little bit about instrument attitude flying when we were student pilots. It was required to get 3 hours, a minimum of 3 hours of instrument attitude flying in preparation for gaining our private pilot certificate, okay? Now, in that learning that we got, who is authorized to teach that basic training that we received? And the factor is any CFI. The truth being, any CFI has to have at least an instrument rating in order to get the CFI. But there is no requirement for them to be an instrument instructor in order to teach those first 3 hours that we need to learn as a student pilot in preparation for the private certificate. And it's quite possible, and I see this especially in the most recent years, that many of the CFIs who are teaching our primary learners, the last time they flew instruments was when they took their instrument practical test, because they're on a race to get to their 1,500 hours and move on to the airlines, get their ATP. So their knowledge is not really there. It's just ready to teach the basics. And what is it that they have to teach us as student pilots? It's specified by the ACS. Straight and level flight, turns to headings, constant airspeeds to climbs and descents, recoveries from unusual attitudes, radio communications, navigation systems facilities, and radar services. That's it. That's all they have to teach us. The reason that they teach us this really is the primary reason, at least, that the agency wants the student pilot to learn this, as well as at least have private pilots have this ability, is if unintentionally they have an IMC encounter, what we call unintended IMC encounters, UIMC, and how we can maintain control and get out of this IMC without losing control. That's the whole purpose of the basics that the student pilot learns this. And there are many private pilots, that's all they know as well. And they're coming back to that. Typically, the instruction focuses primarily on the scan. And there are a variety of different scans that might be taught. One's known as the inverted V, which really doesn't deal with altitude, airspeed, or heading at all. It certainly will work, probably, to keep the wings level and keep you from losing control. It will work and do that. It might be the radial cross-check, going back and forth. Some call this the musical checklist. This includes altitude and heading as well, and coordination, airspeed. That's certainly a little bit better. It might be the rectangular cross-check. The fact of the matter, all of these things are designed to keep the non-instrument rated pilot safe if they have an unintended IMC experience. The problem is in the training, we don't really get quite often to the scenarios. I'm also an examiner, Dan. I don't know whether you mentioned that or not. I am an examiner, and on many private practical tests, in fact, all of my private practical tests, I create a scenario for the IMC work, for the hood work that they're going to have to do. And I'll create a scenario that is very typical of what we've seen in the databases of how people inadvertently get into IMC. Typically lowering ceilings, lowering visibilities. The pilot is endeavoring to get to their destination, whether it's get home or wherever they might be going. They're slowly descending. The visibility is getting worse and worse and worse. They realize they go any lower, they might hit something, they level off, and now they're inadvertently in the clouds. The typical response that is taught by virtually every instructor is to do a 180-degree turn. That is what has been taught for years and years and years. However, I've served in a variety of different FAA industry committees looking at fatal accident causality. Two of them dealt with loss of control. The other one dealt with CFIT, control of flight into terrain. And we saw certainly in loss of control that virtually every time a pilot, this is leading to fatal accidents, every time a pilot got into IMC conditions and attempted to turn, that was when they lost control. So it seems turning might not be such a good idea. Okay. The other thing that we found, and this was in the CFIT work group, and we're just concluding that work, it was a 2-year study, that we had 6 accidents in our fatal accident database of CFIT accidents. 6 of those fatal accidents was when the pilot did do the 180 after encountering unintended IMC and ran into something. They ran into a mountaintop, they ran into a tower, whatever it might be. 6 years ago, I actually wrote a white paper about this because I was seeing the trends. Pilots are dying when they get into IMC. What could help keep them alive? The purpose of these work groups working through the General Aviation Joint Steering Committee is to come up with safety enhancements to give pilots other resources to keep them alive. And I proposed that we were teaching unintended IMC escape strategies all wrong. Number one, we weren't including the scenario in the training. And number two, we weren't including the thing that might very well keep them alive. And I'm happy to say that the FAA finally, it took a lot of fighting from me and a lot of arm twisting, but I got them to agree that we really need to consider what I consider is the most important things to stay alive if you have an unintended IMC encounter. I call them the 5 C's. The first thing, get calm. Typically, and I think many of you might have seen the AOP. It's a great little video called 172 seconds. That's about how long it takes for a pilot to lose control. The important thing is to stay calm, take a couple of breaths, get on the gauges, and get control of the airplane. Get straight and level, get it trimmed up. The next thing is, we all know that there's nothing as useless as altitude above us, runway behind us, and fuel still left on the ground, but there's nothing as useless as altitude above us. Add power. If you're trimmed up, adding power will create a climb. And in fact, back as a student pilot, if you were really taught properly to do constant speed climbs and descents, nothing about rates, all you had to do was constant speed. If you were trimmed, trim will maintain an angle of attack. In level flight, our thrust equals our drag, our lift equals our weight. There we have level flight. If we just increase power, that excess of power will lead to a climb at a constant speed. So climb, get away from the terrain. That's the first thing you need to do after you've gotten control. Get straight and level, trim, add power, the airplane will climb. We don't have to worry about rate, about VX, VY, anything like that. Adding the power will get the airplane climbing. Once you've gotten up where you consider high enough, or perhaps even while you're climbing, call for help. If you've been getting flight following, you've already got the frequency there. If you don't know what frequency, is this an emergency? Heck yes, it is, 121.5. Call for help, and when someone responds, confess your situation. Typically, you will be led, if not immediately, to an ATC facility, eventually to an ATC facility. When they tell you to turn, and eventually at some point you're going to have to turn, don't go back to what you were taught by that non-instrument rated pilot who, non-instrument rated instructor who had gone through instrument training, and they learned about standard rate turns, and they've probably taught you have to roll into a standard rate turn. Baloney. Keep the wings level, just roll to a 10-degree turn. Don't worry about whether you're turning 3 degrees per second or not. It's not that important. It's important that you don't lose control. When you turn 10 degrees maximum, maintaining altitude. If you follow those suggestions that I've come up with, and it'll probably be 6 months to a year before the FAA actually finally publishes this stuff, but I'm guaranteed it'll keep you alive. However, if that CFI who taught you those basics as a student pilot wants to go on to become an instrument instructor, he's going to have to follow the instrument instructor practical test standards. We do not have an ACS yet for the instructor or the instrument instructor. They are there in a draft form. I won't get into why we're not really seeing them yet. It's a long story and I won't go there. But the practical tests now for the instrument instructor say that for flight by reference to instruments, they have to teach either the primary and supporting technique or the control performance method of teaching flight by reference to instruments. I found that many pilots and sometimes even instructors seeking for the instrument instructor are not sure exactly what primary supporting or control performance methods are. So I'd like to run through those pretty quickly here, okay? For primary supporting, as an example, here's our 6-pack of instruments plus some power instruments. For straight and level flight, what is the primary instrument that we need to sustain straight and level flight? So many people on a practical test with me, whether it's for instrument or for that matter, I hate to say it, even instrument instructor, will say the attitude indicator, because that's probably what you were taught back when you were a student pilot. But the fact of the matter is we have to maintain an altitude when we're flying instruments. Thus, the altimeter becomes the primary instrument for pitch in straight and level flight. It is indeed supported by the attitude indicator, the airspeed indicator, and the vertical speed indicator. What about bank? What about bank in straight and level flight? And again, I hear the attitude indicator. Again, referencing back to the primary things that they learned as a student pilot. But the fact of the matter is we have to maintain a heading, whether it's in vectors or to stay on an airway, whatever it might be. The fact of the matter is that the directional gyro, the DG, the heading indicator, or the HSI is the primary instrument for bank in straight and level flight. It is indeed supported by the attitude indicator and the turn coordinator. When we get to primary instruments for power, it's either the manifold pressure gauge if you have a constant speed prop, or just the tachometer if you have a fixed pitch prop. It is supported by the airspeed indicator. And when it comes to trim, well, we can trim really in 3 different axes depending upon the airplane. If you have a Cirrus or you're flying a multi-engine airplane, you're going to be able to trim your ailerons. But for most of the airplanes that the majority of us are flying in single engine GA flying, we can trim the elevator, we can trim the rudder. Primary instrument for trimming the elevator is indeed the attitude indicator. Finally, the attitude indicator is primary for something. So the attitude indicator is primary for trimming the elevator, and the inclinometer, that ball down there, or if you call it the sailboat if you're flying with glass, is primary for trimming the rudder or for the yaw. If you do have aileron trim, as you might in a Cirrus, again, the attitude indicator will become primary for that. Supporting these trims are both the airspeed and the DG or the HSI. So now what about control performance? What are we talking about there? Primary control instruments are the attitude indicator, the turn coordinator, and our power instrument, manifold pressure and tachometer. Our primary performance instruments are the airspeed indicator, the altimeter, and the vertical speed indicator. But to do control performance, we also need to know the numbers. And it's surprising to me that I have instrument applicants for the instrument practical test to get their rating don't know the numbers for their airplanes. The other thing is, many of you might know that I conduct instrument training trips up and down the East Coast. One of them is called the East Coast IFR Experience. It's a 5-day trip starting at Columbia County. We go all the way down to Florida, come all the way back up the coast to Maine, to Bangor, and then back to Columbia County. When pilots are coming in their own airplanes, which I highly recommend, because if they've got their own airplane, that's what you want to train in. Do you know the numbers for your airplane? And I can kind of see deer in the headlights if I happen to personally with them. They don't know what I'm really talking about. But with the numbers, what I'm talking about is that every combination of pitch, power, and configuration will yield a known performance. It's irrefutable. This is physics, okay? As an example, for climbs, when I want to climb in my Cardinal, my power is always going to be set. I fly climbs with wide open throttle. I do fly a turbocharged 182, a T182T. There, I do have a limit on wide open throttle of 5 minutes, and then I have to pull the power back. But basically, in our climbs, our power is set. And we've got 3 basic climbs that we might want to fly, certainly in IFR. Again, for the student pilot, all they need to do is just add power. They will climb if they've already been trimmed. But we're not talking now as instrument pilots. And we're talking about the numbers, and we're talking about control performance, primary supporting, okay? So for a climb, our power is set. We've got 3 types of climbs. It might be a VX climb. We might need that initially on our departure. Perhaps even if we're doing a SID, a standard instrument departure, where we're talking about altitude and distance, we might have a crossing altitude that we have to make in a rather short distance. We're going to use VX. Once that's concerned with, we're concerned about getting to altitude as quickly as possible, and we go to VY. And after we're at a certain altitude, after that, we might very well lower our nose and go to a cruise climb. In my Cardinal, I know with full power, after I rotate and clean things up, clean up my gear and flaps, if I'm pitched to 12 degrees nose up, I'm going to get my VX speed of 78. If I lower the nose to 10 degrees nose up, again, still with full power, that will yield me my best rate climb speed of 82 knots. Once I'm high enough and I'm not concerned about that so much, I'm not concerned about getting up to an altitude quickly or anything, I'm en route. I'm not eager to add hours, as Dan mentioned. I got quite a few of them. So I'm going to lower my nose to a cruise climb. 7.5 degrees nose up will yield me a cruise climb of 90 knots. I'm not going to chase needles. I'm not going to chase a VSI. I'm not going to chase an airspeed. I know the combination of pitch, power, and configuration will yield those 3 numbers. The same thing would come for descents. We basically in IFR flying have 2 types of descents. They might be constant rate, they might be constant speed. They could be possibly also both speed and rate. En route, I'm flying along at 8,000 feet and ATC says descend and maintain 6,000 feet. I know they're expecting me to do about 500 feet a minute, so I merely go to my attitude indicator. I pitch down 2.5 degrees. I trim for that, and now I'm set. And after I've done that, so in the transition, I've used my attitude indicator to establish the transition, 2.5 degrees nose down. Now my main focus goes to the primary instrument, my vertical speed indicator. Am I doing 500 feet a minute? And I trim for it. I am concerned about speed only in the sense that I have to worry about turbulence. If I'm up in the yellow arc, it's smooth, I'm not really too concerned. I'm an old man, I've got biological needs, I want to get there as quickly as I can. I'm not looking to build hours. If I am concerned about turbulence, I certainly have to slow things down. It might be to slow down below the yellow arc and get below VNO. It might even be that I have to consider VA, so I will use my power to control that speed. But basically, I establish this merely by a pitch change to 2.5 degrees nose down, trimming for it, and there I have my 500 foot a minute descent down to my altitude. Just some senses of the numbers. Here is a matrix that I use for my cardinal. On the left, we see all the different operations that we might do. VX, VY, a cruise climb, cruise, a rate descent, basically an en route descent, holding, initial approach speeds, non-precision, precision descents, and missed approach. And across the top, we have the different things that we can change: manifold pressure, RPM, pitch, gear, flaps, indicated airspeed, and rate, and what to expect through the different combinations. So again, if I set any combination, I'm going to get the performance I expect. Perhaps you're flying an airplane with a fixed pitch propeller, such as a 172. And here's a matrix for the 172. You might see that it says sim, and I borrowed this courtesy of a very wonderful young instructor by the name of Ryan Cook. He's with pilotworkshops.com. He has a great program called IFR, The Missing Lessons. I highly recommend that course to virtually everyone, whether you're an instrument pilot, working on the instrument rating, or especially if you're working on the instrument instructor. It's a fantastic course to look at. At any rate, here we see the different ways that we can configure our airplane, the power settings that we'll need, the pitch settings, and the different kinds of performance that they would yield. So now I come back to which do you use? The PTS said either primary supporting or control performance. And I gotta say, what a crock. Because of the fact of the matter is, I use them all, and I certainly teach them all. Primary supporting, control performance, the answer is, it depends. And it depends upon what I want to achieve. So I just talked about it as an example. If I want to achieve a best rate climb, I know what to do. If I want to descend when I'm on an approach, we'll use these. And as we go through this program, at the end of the program, I'll be showing how I use all of this to fly an approach in Columbia County. But this makes me think that one of the more critical times that we really have to be aware of all of this is in the missed approach. The missed approach is a very dangerous time in an IFR flight. Many pilots have come to grief to their end in that missed approach, losing control in the missed approach. It's perhaps the most dangerous time of an IFR flight. So what I'd like to do is show you a video from my East Coast IFR experience of a missed approach. This is going into Martinsville. It was the first day, the fourth approach of the first day of the East Coast IFR experience. And let's take a look and see how we use those numbers.
200 to go. Missed approach. Poor thing, get away from the ground. Above the glide path, don't chase it too hard. Here comes our DA. Yep, 1200. We look out, we don't see anything. Let's get out of here, okay? So full power. Pitch up 10 degrees. Over to right rudder, pitch up 10 degrees, 10 degrees, 10 degrees. Clean up your gear. You're going up. And your flaps. And trim. And trim. Coming for 10 degrees. Yep. Trim some more. Trim some more. Keep it going up. Gear and flaps are up. Okay. Now we're going to fly heading 180. Right. If we were doing this whole thing, we can't.
So that was very short little segment. In this case, we already had missed approach instructions. We know our priorities in any of the flying that we do, certainly in IFR: aviate, navigate, communicate. In the missed approach, the most important thing we need to do is get away from the ground. So we have to pitch up and power up pretty much simultaneously. I apply full power. We have to pitch up, power up, clean up, get up the flaps and gear, If you've got a complex airplane, maybe just the flaps, maybe you had no flaps at all, so there's nothing to change in configuration. But the last thing is to trim up, and I've seen so many pilots kind of forget about the trim in that missed approach. And the problem with this is they'll pitch up to whatever is required. Typically it's 10 degrees. That'll yield most airplanes a best rate climb. Their head now goes down to look at their missed approach procedures in their lap. As their head comes down, if they haven't trimmed, the nose comes down. The only good thing about this is that the airplane accelerates. And when you hit the obstacle, death is instantaneous. You don't even have time to say, "Bah." So don't forget to trim to keep that nose up so it doesn't come down as you look to the missed approach procedures. I'd like to move on now to situational awareness. Several of you, perhaps many of you, have seen my presentation on IFR flying and situational awareness. There are many things that are involved. I have a whole list of all the things that we need to be aware of situationally as we fly IFR. But when it comes to instrument attitude flying, the most important thing is our three-dimensional position. We need to be able to answer 4 different questions. A three-dimensional situation is going to help us answer those. We need to answer, number 1, where am I? Number 2, where am I headed? Number 3, what has to happen when I get there? And number 4, what can I be doing now to prepare for that? So I'm going to show another little video clip. This was at the end of day 1, doing an RNAV 17 into Asheville, North Carolina. Just to give you some sense of situational awareness, we had proceeded to an initial fix of ONZIG, which had a hill put, a hold in lieu of procedure turn. We'd gone outbound on that procedure turn, and we're now turning around and coming back inbound to ONZIG as the final fix. Let's join Billy and me in the RNAV 17 to Asheville.
So at ONZIG, what do we do? ONZIG, we're going to go down to 5,000. Yep. But right now, probably close to 500 feet a minute. So we're not past ONZIG yet. So. Not past ONZIG, so if we're doing a couple, BS 500, maybe even 600. Right. And power back down to about 15 inches. Right now, we're doing 110. Little less than that, 109. That's what I'm expecting with 10 of flaps and this power setting. So that's good. Yep. Okay. These are the numbers. These are the numbers. Okay, so get ready to start now. Let's put BS. Or go for it. Take it to 600. Maybe we can go to 700. Down to 7. Power down to 14. Power to 14. What should happen at Luigi? Should level off at 5,000. Yeah, altitude. What else should happen? As we cross Luigi. We're going to put our gear down. No. No. What should happen there? We should start picking up the glide scope. No. It's going to go, well, yeah. We'll start, it should go into approach mode. Okay. Right now, we're still in terminal. Right. Final fix is STOS. So when we cross Luigi, STOS becomes the active waypoint. We should see LPV. We should see a glide path. We'll just level off and wait for the glide path. If we don't see the glide path and LPV, we step down to 4,000 manually. Okay. We're going to need about 800 feet a minute here, so we can increase that. And bring it from the contact tower 121.1. Have a good day. Over to tower 121.1. Thank you. 516 Alpha Pop. Let them know we're outside Luigi. Ground 121.9. Asheville Tower, November 516 Alpha Pop, just outside Luigi inbound. November 516 Alpha Pop, Asheville Tower, good afternoon. Continue for runway 17. 516 Alpha Pop, headed for runway 17. Yep. Go for it, come in with your power, back up to 20 inches or 18 inches. 0 Bravo. Good. And we're just going to stay here. Right, and wait till we intercept the glide path. Zero, Bravo, correct. Continue to Bravo 2. As we cross Luigi, we'll look for LPV. We'll look for glide slope to show up there. We'll look for glide GS, altitude and GS there. We'll look for glide path to appear up there. We'll look for it here as well. Yep. There it is, LPV. The glide path showed up there. And we've got glide slope arm down in the autopilot. Okay. Life is good. Yeah, what point gear? At the autopilot right now. Right the auto. Yep. Here comes the gear. Yep. It just as it grabbed it and power back to 14 inches.
So there we were flying the RNAV 17. It's an LPV into Asheville. There's some questions you might have about that hopefully we'll get to later on. We will get to later on some of the things that we're doing. I just also want to mention the pilot in the left seat, Billy Winburn. He is the principal of community aviation. He proposed that we do my East Coast trip and that they would film every single minute of the trip, starting at 7 a.m. when I'd meet Billy for breakfast, and we brief out the weather for the day, the approaches that we do. Everything was filmed, all the approaches, everything, right through until the end of the day. At the end of the day, when we did the final debrief for everything that occurred during the day. This particular approach was the sixth approach of day one. Billy was kind of tired. He was a relatively new instrument rated pilot. Many pilots come to me, they've got the rating, but they don't really know how to fly in the IFR world. They don't know how to negotiate with ATC. Quite often, they don't know their numbers and they really don't understand attitude instrument flying. So Billy learned quite a bit on that week. If you join this program, you learn quite a bit just seeing it virtually. So let's move on and talk a little bit about our navigation aids before we get into how we actually fly these approaches. Primarily, we've got VOR localizer versus GPS. Now, some of you might say, oh, well, what about NDB? Well, that's great. For all of you who said, what about NDB? I'll turn it right around and turn it right back at you and say, do you have an ADF that really works? And wonderful. And if you come to me for a practical test with that ADF, don't placard it in op unless you've also said it's in op in your maintenance manual as well. Okay, so yeah, we do have NDBs out there as well, but they're quickly disappearing almost as fast as VORs are disappearing. So let's discuss the differences between the two. So starting with VLO, VORs and localizers, the most important thing is they are ground-based. Okay, all the transmitters for these devices, for these nav aids, are based on the ground, and as such, our reception of them is predicated upon line of sight. So certainly our altitude has something to do with this. Our distance from the transmitter has a lot to do with how well we receive those individual nav aids, whether it VOR or localizer. Furthermore, we can navigate to or from them. Certainly VOR, we might navigate back in the day. That's how I learned. I learned basically with just 2 VORs. In fact, the matter is on my instrument practical test, I had to fly an intersection hold and I was limited to 1 nav aid, 1 VOR. And I'd have to switch back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I did not have flip-flop frequencies. It was a boogie back then, but that's the way we did it. And we could navigate to or from a VOR, or for that matter, from a localizer. For those of you who've been flying IFR for a while prior to GPS, quite often to get established on a localizer or an ILS, for that matter, even a VOR approach, we might fly to an outer marker, a co-located outer marker. We found our way there by using our ADF. There was an NDB at that outer marker as well. We would then fly outbound with a from indication on the localizer, getting reverse sensing, do our procedure turn and then come back in. So we could navigate to from these nav aids. The sensitivity of all of them was angular, is angular. not was, they're still out there. They still work, a few of them. It's an angular sensitivity. The closer we are to the transmitting antenna, the more sensitive our needles will be. We'll get more into depth on angular sensitivity for VORs and localizers a few slides later on. Okay. They are also, or at least the VOR, can be used as a resolver. And what I mean by that, a lot of people look at me sometimes and I see the question mark in their eyebrows. What do you mean by resolver, Doug? What I mean by resolver is, back in the day, for that matter, even now, believe it or not, every once in a while I get an applicant for an instrument practical test and they're filing slant uniform, just two VORs. So ATC might say, clear direct the ABC VOR when able. What you would do is put in the frequency, listen to the Morse code, identify it, make sure it was the right one, turn your omni-bearing selector or your HSI until you got a 2 indication on your ambiguity indicator, and then center the D bar, the deviation bar, until it was centered, and that would resolve your navigation problem. That would be the bearing to the VOR. We could resolve those issues. Let's compare that to GPS. So first thing, I think everyone is keenly aware that GPS is space-based. As such, we need sufficient satellites. The fact of the matter is we need at least a minimum of 4 satellites to be able to get the triangulation that is necessary to navigate, okay? A GPS is designed to basically always navigate to a fix or to a waypoint. Instead of, we could suspend it and we could navigate from, and that might very well be a situation where we were told an unexpected and unpublished hold at a waypoint, at a fix, whether it's a VOR or it's a intersection, an IFR intersection. We could navigate from, but primarily the GPS is designed to always sequence to a fix. Its sensitivity is linear, and this is based upon how far from our waypoint we are, whether it's the departure waypoint or the destination waypoint or waypoints along the way. We'll discuss this a little bit more in greater depth in a few more slides. But the sensitivity is angular. There are basically 3 different levels of sensitivity. As far as resolving things, if we want to go somewhere, if we're cleared to direct the ABC VOR, we put the ABC VOR, enter it as a waypoint, press direct to, and now the GPS is going to navigate from that point directly to the waypoint. And no matter how we turn our CD, our omni-bearing selector or our course arrow on an HSI, it's not going to affect the needle. It's only going to go to that waypoint. So the basics of VOR versus GPS. Let's talk little bit now about the sensitivity. In VOR, each dot on our omni-bearing selector or HSI typically is equal to 2 degrees. In a localizer, it is 4 times as sensitive. Each dot is a half a degree. So that if we had a 2-dot deflection, we'd actually be in the VOR, we'd be 4 degrees off course. In the localizer, we'd only be 1 degree off. At 16, for the VOR, at 16 nautical miles, and this is actually plane geometry, and it really doesn't even matter whether we're talking VOR or localizer because this is applicable to both. At 60 nautical miles, every degree is 1 mile apart. Envision, if you would, a bicycle wheel with spokes coming out of the hub. The hub might very well be the VOR. If we look at how far apart the spokes are spaced at 60 miles, let's say the rim of this wheel is 60 miles from the hub, each spoke being a degree would be 1 mile apart. Okay. If that rim came into 30 miles, each degree would be a half a mile apart. At 15 nautical miles, each degree is only a 1/4 mile apart. Back in the day, When I was learning to fly, I didn't have an airplane with DME. I'd always use cross radials. And quite often I'd find sometimes I've tried to find VORs that might be 30 or close to 30 miles offset to the side. And an example, when I used to do the VOR 13 into Bennington, Vermont, the Cambridge VOR was just about 30 miles from Albany. So when I saw that I had 10 degrees to go, I'd use my number 2 nav, Omni bearing selector. When I saw that I had 10 degrees to get to that crossing radial across Cambridge, I'd know I was 5 miles away. So things of that nature. So knowing this is still helpful for those of you who might be flying glass and have bearing pointers. I personally am using my bearing pointers on my Aspen all the time, and I still use this kind of stuff, even though I've got all that other information available through my GPS. Talk a little bit about GPS sensitivity. If we have a non-WASP GPS, when it says where you are and gives a lat-long coordinate, it's actually going to have you within 50 feet of that lat-long coordinate. Okay. If we have WASP-enabled GPS, it is only 10 feet. For those of you who are flying with the 406 ELT, and you're hooked up to a WASP-enabled GPS, when it sends out your position, and whoever it might be, whether it's the CAP, Civil Air Force Patrol, whatever it might be, when they get to that point, they could land in a helicopter and turn and see you, turn 360 degrees, and they would see you within 10 feet of where they landed. So WASP accuracy is much, much greater. Talking about sensitivity of the GPS, we have those 3 basic modes: en route, terminal, and the final approach mode. It's also important to know when it's going to go into those different modes. So let's look a little greater depth at what those are, okay? Terminal mode, which is basically where we would start in an IFR flight, is when we are in terminal mode, the CDI from center to full scale deflection will show you that you are 1 nautical mile off. So from full scale left to full scale right covers a 2-mile wide course. Question becomes, when are we in terminal mode? Now, it is for the first 30 nautical miles of the flight if our first waypoint is within those 30 miles. If you're a VFR pilot and you're using GPS as a go perfectly straight tool, you want to fly to lunch somewhere, you know, you're going to do that $200 hamburger, price has gone up now. You want to do that $200 hamburger to a restaurant that's 100 miles away. When you put in that waypoint, your GPS is going to start in en route mode. If it is WASP enabled, from center to full scale deflection will be 2 nautical miles, or full scale to full scale, 4 nautical miles. If you are a non-WASP GPS, it would be 5 nautical miles from center to full scale deflection, or 10 miles width of your course. Now again, if your first waypoint is less than 30 miles, as it will be in virtually every IFR flight, your first fix, whether you're doing an ODP, a SID, whatever it might be, I'm guaranteeing you that your first fix is going to be somewhere, anywhere perhaps between 2, 5, maybe as a max 10 miles away. Your GPS will start in terminal mode, 1 mile, center to full scale deflection. When you get 30 miles away from your departure, it will switch to en route mode. Now you might be flying along, let's say that you're flying along and you've been flying coupled, but you don't have GPS roll steering, so you're staying coupled and you're controlling your roll basically with a heading mode. And your heading mode has not been perfect. You're not really tracking your desired track. You're flying along and you notice that you've got about a 2.5 mile, a 2.5 dot deflection on your Omni bearing selector or on your HSI. And you're looking at that, and then you go heads down, you're starting to brief your approach, whatnot, and you come back up and you notice that your CDI needle is now almost fully deflected. You kind of How did that happen? Did my GPS, did my autopilot disconnect? Is my heading off? How did I turn? How did I get from just a half deflection, 2.5 dot deflection to full deflection? Well, if you look at your distance to your destination, you'll probably see that it just became 30 nautical miles or perhaps a little less, and you have switched from en route to terminal. The last mode that we have is our approach mode. And there are a variety of different types of approaches that we might possibly get. If you have a non-WAS GPS, the only approach that you're going to be able to get with your GPS is an LNAV approach. It's the only kind of approach that you can get. We'll talk more about the details of these in just a little bit, so hang tight. However, if you have a WAS-enabled GPS, there are 6 different types of approaches that you could get. You could potentially get an LPV. You could get LNAV VNAV. LNAV VNAV does require a barrel-aided GPS. I will say that in all the years that I've been flying GPS approaches, and I started GPS approaches back in 1994 when I got my first Garmin 430. In all those years and all those hours, I've only flown 3 LNAV VNAV approaches. But so LPV, LNAV VNAV, LNAV plus V, LNAV, LP, and LP plus V. 6 different types of approaches. 3 of them have angular sensitivity from the final fix inbound. Okay. 4 of them have vertical guidance, but only 2 of them, the LP and the LNAV VNAV, have vertical guidance to a decision altitude. The other 4, LNAV plus V, even though it gives vertical guidance, still goes to an MDA. The same thing with LNAV. LP is angular. LP plus V gets vertical guidance, but again, it only goes to an MDA. Hang tight here. I will explain why in a few more slides, okay? But the more important thing that I want to ask now, if we've got 6 different types of approaches that we might potentially get as we're flying into an airport doing an instrument approach, how will we know what type to expect? When will we find out whether the GPS has sufficient RAIM, Receiver Autonomous Integrity Monitor, whether it is receiving enough satellites to give us that vertical or not? What happened here? If we are non-WAS, when we reach 2 nautical miles from the final approach fix, the GPS will start skewing down from 1 mile sensitivity, the terminal mode, to 0.3 of a mile, 0.3 nautical miles at the final approach fix. If you're looking at your CDI on the GPS, if you have that page up, you will see it giving cross-track error going from 1.0, 0.9, 0.8, 0.76543 at the final fix. However, if we have a WAS-enabled GPS, we're going to find out what type of any one of those 6 approaches we are going to get. And please take notes on this one if you take no other notes. We will find out when the final fix becomes the active waypoint. Quite typically, if you're doing a kind of standard RNAV approach that might have an LPV, as you turn inbound at the intermediate fix, it might also be an initial fix with the hold in lieu of procedure turn. As you turn inbound, there's no step down. Remember, a GPS is always going to sequence to the next fix. As you turn inbound, it sequences to the final fix. At that point, you will see whether you're going to get vertical guidance or not. The GPS will enunciate LPV, and you will see a glide slope depiction show up either on your glass, or you'll see that your V-bar goes up if you're operating with a GPS coupled omni bearing selector. Okay. Now, it is also possible that if you activate vectors to final, all those other fixes outside of the final approach fix disappear from the flight plan, and the final fix becomes the active waypoint at that point. Okay. There's a lot more that goes on with that, and I really don't have the time or space in this presentation to discuss a little bit more about vectors to final using a WAS-enabled GPS. But at some point, we'll be able to be putting that one on for everyone as well. So anyway, remember, you're going to find out the type of approach when the final fix becomes the active waypoint. You might have even heard me in that last video clip kind of coaching Billy, saying, well, when are we going to find out? And he said at Luigi, well, no, that's not the final, was not the final fix. When we cross that, the final fix becomes the active waypoint, that's when we would find out. I'd like to now compare the localizer and compare that with the LPV, localizer performance with vertical, or localizer precision with vertical. On virtually every instrument practical test that I give, folks who are anticipating come to me for a practical test, take your notes now and you won't miss this question. How wide is the localizer at the threshold? There's only one answer to this. You can't hem and haw. There's only one answer. The localizer is designed to be 700 feet at the threshold. And this is applicable not only to a localizer and or ILS, but also to the LPV and the LP and LP plus V approaches. Those needles, when you get down to the threshold from full scale deflection left to full scale deflection right, going to be 700 feet, 350 feet either side of the localizer. So my next question in the practical test says, well, how wide is it going to be at the final fix? And I typically kind of see deer in the headlights, kind of wondering about this one. Yikes, gee, I don't know. And if they were wise, they'd say, well, it depends. And it depends whether it's a localizer or an LPV. In the case of an LPV, it's always going to be fixed. I'll tell you what that is in just a second. But for the localizer itself, it does depend on several things. Number one, it depends on how long the runway is. We have to understand that the localizer antenna is positioned at the far end of the runway. The runway that we are approaching, it is at the far end of that, and it is typically placed anywhere between 500 to 1,000 feet from the far end of the runway. It now goes out angularly at anywhere from 3 degrees to 7 degrees to be 700 feet at the threshold. Well, that certainly depends on how long is the runway. We have ILSs to runway as short as 5,000 feet. We might be going into somewhere like Stewart and Newburgh. We might be going into Bangor. We might be going into Portsmouth. We might be going into Plattsburgh. There are all these military runways that are 12,000 feet long. Well, if it's 12,000 feet long, that localizer is going to be much wider wherever that final fix is. So the length of the runway has something to do to it. The other thing is how far from the runway is that final fix. It might very well be at an outer marker, as an example. Okay, so it does depend on how far. Now, in the case of kind of a standard a localizer where the outer marker is going to be about 5 miles from the runway. And again, it can be anywhere from 4 to 7. And in fact, I go into Wilkes-Barre quite frequently. I go there, it's the first approach on my East Coast trip. The final fix is 10 miles from the runway threshold. So things are going to be a lot wider out there. But the typical 5-mile width would have your localizer 3,270 feet wide from full scale to full scale at that final fix, or basically 1,635 feet center to full scale deflection. Now, when it comes to the LPV, the localizer is going to be 700 feet at the threshold, and it's going to be that 0.6 of a mile at the outer marker or final fix, irrespective of how far from the runway that fix is. The angle is designed to have it so basically 0.3 of a mile from center to full scale deflection. So it's going to be 0.6 of a mile out there at the final fix. That width actually is narrower than the localizer at 5 miles. It's always going to be the same, and it's going to be 6/10 of a mile wide, which is 3,168 feet, 3/10 of a mile, or 1,584 centered to full scale deflection. And you might be saying, Doug, why are you getting into such detail here and such minutia? Do we really need to know this? To me, it is somewhat important. It has to do with situational awareness. If I'm getting vectors to an ILS or to a localizer or to an LPV, it does somewhat depend to me on this. If it's a 12,000 foot runway, I'm getting vectors. I know I've got a tailwind, and I know I'm using my cross-track error as a piece of data to know how far I am perpendicularly to that final approach course. And I see I'm coming in and I'm waiting for that 30-degree turn to intercept, and it's coming late. I know the longer that runway, the faster that D-bar is going to be coming into me. And I'm going to have to really pay attention when I'm given that 30-degree intercept, aviate, turn to the heading, navigate, make sure I grab that D-bar as I come in and track it on down, and then finally communicate. So knowing this does help me. Maybe it's too much minutia for you, but it certainly helps me, and it is somewhat important. Now, there might be some questions. Well, wait a second, Doug, you've talked about the LPV and you've talked about the localizer, but what about that LNAV plus V or the LP plus V? And you mentioned that they only go to an MDA, not to a decision altitude, but to a minimum descent altitude. And the reason is that in the LNAV and the LNAV plus V, the navigation is linear. It stays at 3/10 of a mile from center to full scale deflection from the final fix all the way into the missed approach point, which is typically at the threshold. Now, the glide path that we get with an LNAV plus V is going to be identical to the glide path we get with the LPV. And perhaps you've even flown this on a VFR day, and you've flown that glide path down on an LNAV plus V, and see, it takes you right to the 1,000-foot marker, just as it would in an LPV. And they say, well, why do I have to go with the MDA? The reason has to do with the lateral navigation, because the LNAV is 3/10 of a mile. It gets no narrower. What if there is a crane? What if there's a crane sitting there just a half a mile from the threshold of the runway? It is outside the angular deflection for the localizer, but it is inside that 3/10 of a mile. And if you are not keeping the needle completely centered, maybe you got a 3.5, 4-dot deflection. In the localizer, you'd still be protected, but if you were flying an LNAV, you would not be protected. Maybe it was a tree, and you could very easily run into those obstacles or obstructions, okay? In the LP plus V, the purpose there is that you might have flown an ILS that has a vertical segment that finishes the approach. So if the LP plus V is very similar to that. An example, I just flew one the other day in IMC, kind of right down to minimums. The RNAV 11 into Great Barrington is an LP plus V. But we have to fly it to an MDA, because if we were to continue down the glide slope, we would run into those big spruce trees that are out there just beyond the approach end of runway 11. So it's a vertical segment, and that's the purpose for the MD on the LP plus V. It is angular, just like an LPV, but you've got a visual segment to conclude the approach. So thus you have to level off at an MDA and continue until you have runway environment to conclude the approach. So now I'd like to get into how I brief an approach, how I use all these tools to fly an approach. And what I'm going to use is the RNAV 3 into Columbia County Airport, okay? Basically, let's say I'm coming in from the west. I had basically filed however I'd gotten there, maybe from Binghamton, Victor 270 to Athos intersection. Athos intersection is right there. So 270, this is Victor 270. Athos, direct Columbia County. Okay. Starting out somewhere well to the west of the airport, even though it is my own airport, I'm going to be briefing that approach. I'll still be talking to Boston Center. I'll be briefing the approach and planning out what I want to do. hoping that by the time I get to Agnes, I will have been handed off to Albany, and then I'll give them a request. Actually, I'll give them the request as soon as I'm handed off. So I'm back out to the west of Agnes. I'm still in Boston Center, and I'm starting to brief the approach. Before I get into this, I do want to say I'm using a JEPS plate, and I know a lot of you don't. You use NACO because they're free with ForeFlight, which is wonderful. I pay the extra money for the JEPS for several reasons. The first one is the briefing strip. Jeppesen were the first people to come up with the whole concept of a briefing strip. There was a wonderful gentleman by the name of Jim Terpstra that designed this briefing strip. It is much simpler than the NACO briefing strip, and it gives me all the important information, aside from the approach that we need to know, which is up there. I've got my frequencies. I'm going to brief left to right, top to bottom. So starting on the left, I get the weather. I'll put that in to my number 2 radio. I'll bring it over to the active, listening to the AWAS. I will see who my final approach controller is. Typically, I might know that. If I don't, I see the final approach controller. I'll put that in the standby of my number 1 radio. I'll then see if there's a tower, I'll have a tower frequency. In this case, it's a Unicom frequency. If there's a tower, there'll also be a ground control frequency, and I'll put that in the standby of my number 2 com radio. Going along, I've got military frequencies, don't worry about that, but my final approach course, my crossing altitude at the final fix, and the DA for my approach if it's a DA, or the MDA if it isn't, and airport elevation. Before we get on to briefing the laterals, but that's briefing the top, briefing my frequencies and things of that. Another reason why I like JEPS is for the vertical guidance, just the way my mind processes step downs. I see them as a step down to a level off, a step down to a level off. When I look at a NACO plate, it's just this straight line, and I just find that the JEPS makes that so much more easy. The third thing that I love about JEPS is that down here in this not lower left, but lower part left side, I have a matrix that shows me, especially on vertical guidance, predicated upon my ground speed that I can get from my GPS, I will know what rate is required to fly that particular glide path. In this case, it is a 3-degree glide path, which is somewhat standard, but I have the rates required predicated upon my ground speed. Again, this goes back to performance numbers. We'll talk a little bit more about glide path in just a couple of slides. So going back to briefing the approach, after I've briefed everything across the top, I move down to the lateral plan because I want to find out where is the final fix. And I see, okay, it's COPAP, and it's marked by that Maltese cross. It doesn't matter whether we're dealing with NACO or JEPS, it's got that Maltese cross. So I know that when that fix, in this case COPAP, becomes the active waypoint, I will find out what kind of approach I can get. Will I get an LPV, which I might very well get? I know I'm not going to get on that VNAV because I don't have the equipment, but if there isn't sufficient satellites, if there isn't SBAS or GBAS, I might only get an LNAV approach, meaning I'm going to have to do those step downs. So I want to know where's the final fix. Then I'll look and say, okay, well, where's the fix before the final fix? When will the final fix become the active waypoint? And it will be as I cross Haroy. And I notice here that I have to cross Haroy at 2,200 feet, which means I'm also going to have to step down from Crowell 3,200 feet. I'm going to have to do a step down. I'm not going to get any vertical guidance on that. I'm going to need to know my numbers of how to make that descent, staying at a stabilized approach speed. Okay. The next thing I'm going to look for is, okay, Crowell. Crowell is what we call an IAF or IF. It's an initial fix. If there is a hold to be flown, what we know the hold in lieu of procedure turn, it's possible if I was coming in from the north that I'd want to fly to Crowell and do the procedure turn. I personally would not do that. I'd find it faster to come to one of the feeder fixes, either Puck B or a Nope. I'd come straight in and come across, but perhaps I want to do that. Or in this case, it's going to be in an intermediate fix. I know that coming up to the intermediate fix, I'm I'm also going to have to turn inbound there. I want to be at my known approach speed for that intermediate phase of the approach. I need to know what power, what configuration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I need to know how long it might take me to get slowed up to get to those configurations. So it's important for me to know what altitude I have to be at that fix. The next thing I might look at is, in this case, there is a terminal arrival area. And I see, looking at that coming in from the west, out 30 miles, I'm going to have to be up at 6,300 feet. And I can't get any lower than that until I am 7 miles from Anope, the initial fix. Okay. It's because of the Catskills and because of the terrain, and also because we're probably going to be off route at that point. I know that as I come up to Agnes, I'm going to be requesting direct Anope. Anyway, going back a little bit, so I'm still back west of Agnes. I've briefed everything out. I've set up my vertical speed to reach Crowell, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit more, to reach Crowell at 3,200 feet before I get there. I'm anticipating it. When I am handed off to Albany from Boston Center, my frequency is already in there. I bring it up. It is important that I let them know, it's the final approach controller, that I have the 1 minute weather, what we call the AWAS. I have the 1 minute weather and my request. What approach am I requesting? If we don't give that, they're going to say, do you have the 1 minute weather? What approach are you requesting? So if I was handed off to Albany, Cardinal 516 Alpha Papa 7,000, we've got the 1 minute weather at Columbia, requesting direct Anope for the RNAV 3. I've given them my request. I might not get it yet, but they know what I want. They know I want to go to Anope. In preparing for this, I'm going to go here. This is a simulator for the 760. In my Cardinal, I actually have a 430, but the displays look the same. I have already set up my vertical navigation, okay, to be 2 miles before Crowell at 3,200 feet. And the GPS is going to constantly compute, predicated upon my current ground speed, in this case 120 knots. I would need 640 feet a minute to reach 3,200 feet 2 miles before Crowell. Now, typically our clearance would be from Albany would be clear direct Anope, cross Anope at or above 3,200 feet. If they said at 3,200 feet, I'd have to really come down maybe 800 to 1,000 feet a minute, dependent upon how hard that west wind was blowing to get down there. It's going to hurt my ears. I don't have to be at 3,200 feet at Anope. I was cleared at or above. So I set my vertical speed for that. Also notice, if I were hand flying, my desired track from my present position when I was cleared direct Anope is 161 degrees. I am also tracking. These are the two pieces of information I will have in a 430 or a 650. If my desired track and the track are the same and my D bar, my course deviator indicator, is centered, it's not going to move. Furthermore, if I am flying with glass, I might very well have a track bug in my HSI, which I do in my Aspen, and I have synced my heading bug to whatever heading I am flying to track the desired track. It makes it so easy when there's a crosswind. Even if we don't have a track bug in an HSI, if our track and desired track are the same and the needle is centered, it becomes a piece of cake. If we had to do partial panel, if we were to lose our HSI, if we were to lose our attitude indicator, just using this information would allow us to continue our navigation with incredible accuracy. They've cleared me down. I now have to set my pitch and my power, perhaps my configuration, to come down to level off. And so I'm setting my power. I know I'm going to gain an inch for every 1,000 feet that I descend once I'm below about 6,000 feet. No later than when I have reached 4,200 feet, 1,000 feet above my target altitude, I'll bring my power back down to 17 inches of manifold pressure. I'll gain an inch in that 1,000 feet of descent. So as I level off 2 miles before Crowell, my manifold pressure will be at 18 inches. I will slow to 115 knots, well below my 130 knot speed for flaps. Put in my 10 of flaps will then slow me down to 105, and now I'm prepared, ready to make the turn at a nope. So what happens at a nope? Well, at a nope, I'm going to have to turn and descend down to 2,200 feet. So I need to know, where am I going to look when I get to Crowell? Because my GPS is going to count this down for me. It's going to come up when I've got about 10 seconds to go to Crowell, to come up and say next desired track 025 in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Turn now, desired track 025. When it says turn now, the algorithm is predicated upon flying a standard rate turn. Well, how do I know what will yield a standard rate turn? And I got to say, folks, for as numerically challenged as I am, this one is pretty easy. In order to fly a standard rate turn, where I'm going to look is at my attitude indicator, because I have learned that if I know my ground speed, I can find out my bank angle, and the formula is very simple. Take your ground speed, divide it by 10, and add 5. In the scenario above, we were doing 120 knots. As I leveled off and my power was adjusted, I'm going to bring power B at 18 inches. As I level off, I'm doing 120 because I've got a tailwind. I divide that by 10 is 12. I add 5, 17 degrees of bank. When it says turn now, I look at my attitude indicator. I roll to 17 degrees. Do I have that precision as a pilot? No, I don't, but I'll roll just a little bit more than halfway between the 10 and the 20. I know I also have to descend, so I'm going to, still looking at the attitude indicator, pitch down 2.5 degrees, reach over to my throttle and pull my power back to 14 inches. This will give me approximately a 500 foot per minute descent at 105, my initial approach speed. I'll then look at how much time I have to Crowell. I can do this math. I've got 1,000 feet to lose from 3,200 to 2,200. Okay, if I've got 2 minutes, 500 feet will work great. If I've got less than 2 minutes, I'm going to need more than 500 feet a minute. If I've got more than 2 minutes, I don't quite need 500. I'll still go for 500 feet a minute to be able to get down there. Okay, I know that as I cross Hawaii, it's going to switch to approach mode. I'm going to see my glide path. In this instance, I'll be right below the glide path because there's only a little more than 2 miles from Hawaii to Kopap final fix. As soon as that glide path centers, I'll drop my gear, pitch down 2.5 degrees, pull my power back down to 14 inches, and continue on down my approach anywhere between 90 to 95, which has me below my VFE for 20 degrees of flaps and 95. Knowing where I am, where I'm headed, what has to happen when I get there, and how I'm going to be prepared for this makes flying this approach really pretty simple. Oh, let me go back. What I'd like to do now is show one more approach. This is an approach into Hagerstown, the RNAV 27 that we did during the approach, this approach is actually the lunch stop on the first day of the IFR, East Coast IFR experience. And here we go.
6 Alpha Papa contact, Potomac approach 126.82. 12682, thank you, 516 Alpha Pop. 944 Charlie, Potomac approach, Dan, climb, maintain 4,000. Get to 4,000 now, King Area 44 Charlie. Potomac approach, Cardinal 516 Alpha Pop. 6,000 request Zupox for the RNAV 27, full stop. 516 Alpha Pop, Potomac approach, direct to Zupox for the RNAV 27 in the Hagerstown. You said you had the weather? Got the weather, 516 Alpha Pop. Oh, that's one. Yeah, there you go. Activate approach. Thank you. Okay, so now our VSR is correct. Yes. 6 Alpha Pop, set maintain 5,000. Set maintain 5,000, 516 Alpha Pop.
He is using autopilot here, but basically for hand flying, I pitch down 2.5 degrees, pull my power back down to 14 inches, maintain that speed, constant speed.
Take an inch off. So, dialing 6 Alpha Pop, 7 miles from Zupox. Zupox, at or above 4,000, clear for the straight in, RNAV runway close to back center above 4,000, clearing for the ONAV 27, full stop, 516 Alpha Pop. We need 450 feet a minute, so let's get into 500 now. And I'm not sure if that was set for 4,000 or not. Yes, it was. Delta the tunnel proceed to right, the westward to VOR. 4,000. And in this direction, yes. I'm going to pull it back to 20. 19. We'll be at 20 when we get to 4,000. Good point. Okay. 1,000 feet to go. Straight in. Oh, we got 100 feet to go. Wouldn't have to touch the throttle, but you can throw us down to 115. Yep, right at 20. But with your 10 of flaps, because we're coming right up to it. Yep, here we go. Ready for the turn. We're right at 4,000. The other thing too, you have to be in altitude mode for it in order for it to get the glide slope. Okay. Glide path in the case of. Look up some good rain. 10 seconds. Turning right. 266. We're looking for it to go into LPV. We'll see it here as well. When it does, we'll see our relationship to the glide path. LPV. Going 6 off top, contact Hagerstown Tower 120.3. 120.3 over the tower, 516 Alpha Pop. Aviate, approach, approach, approach. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Outside Nolan. Hagerstown Tower, 516 Alpha Pop, outside Nolan. 516 Alpha Pop, Hagerstown Tower, report Nolan. We'll report Nolan, 516 Alpha Pop. And comes the gear. Altitude went out, glide slope went on, it comes down to 2.5 degrees, and you come back to 14 inches. Okay. We got a green light, gas, mixture, prop.
When you heard me shouting, just you might have been curious when you heard me shouting, approach, approach, approach. What I was urgently encouraging Billy to do was to switch the GPS to approach mode. I've seen many pilots say that they have trouble. Their GPS won't capture the glide path and they don't know why. You have to be in approach mode, not in a nav mode, not in GPS roll steering. You have to be in approach mode if you want to capture the glide path. And that was just an urgent reminder to him because we're coming up to the glide path pretty quickly. And in order for the autopilot to grab it, he needed to get into approach mode. So let's talk a little bit, we're almost to the end here, about how to fly an approach. And what I'm talking about are what are the controls that we use to fly an approach. For an example, to maintain the localizer, to stay on the center of the localizer, do we use aileron or rudder? And I hate to say it, but I see so many pilots, or more than I really want to see, come for a practical test or come for training with me. They've never trained with me before, that are trying to skid down a localizer. Folks, it just unstabilizes everything. As we yaw the airplane, it affects our speed, it creates more drag, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For those of you who have an autopilot that will fly a localizer, I'm sure you don't have a 3-axis autopilot that's controlling the rudder as well. The airplane will fly the localizer with roll alone. Even in the Cardinal I had before the one I have now, I had an STEC 30 autopilot. It only had high intensity or low intensity nav, but it would fly an approach in high intensity, and it did it solely with roll, okay? I remember years ago hearing Wally Moran, one of my peers at pilotworkshops.com, giving a presentation on flying an approach. And of course, he always talks about syncing the heading bug to the reference heading. When I'm flying an approach, if my desired track and the track are the same and my D-bar is centered, I have synced my heading bug. I might be holding 10, 15, 20 degrees of correction, but I've synced that heading bug. So in my scan, I see I'm off the heading bug. I go right back to it and center it. I remember Wally saying in this presentation to his learners, he allows them to fly 3 headings on an approach: the center of the heading bug, the left side, or the right side. A heading bug is 10 degrees wide. There's no reason not to be able to maintain that CDI needle, keeping it centered, flying the heading bug, doing rolls of no more than 5 degrees, unless the wind really shifts major, which can happen. So flying a localizer, we use the aileron. To maintain the localizer, we use the aileron, we roll. What about the glide slope? Do we use elevator or throttle? I see a lot of pilots are trying to fly the glide slope or the glide path using their throttle. This is what they were taught as a student pilot learning to land the airplane. But it's not how we fly an approach, okay? We're going to use the elevator to stay on the glide path. And I'd like to get into this in a little bit of more depth and a little bit of minutia, if I might. So please humor me, okay? When we were learning as student pilots to land, we wanted a stabilized approach, which meant on spot, on speed. The same thing for an instrument approach. Definitely from the final fix, if not sooner, we want to be at a constant speed on a constant glide path. Now, it might be a non-precision approach, so we still keep constant speed, okay? If it's precision, we want to stay on the glide path. To stay on that glide path requires a rate that is totally dependent upon our ground speed. We might end up having to fly an approach with a tailwind. The faster our ground speed, the greater the rate it will be required to stay on this glide path. It might be a 3-degree glide path. It might be a 3.5-degree glide path. I remember once back, there was never really a published glide path, but there was a single light VASI into Great Barrington. It was set at a 4.5-degree glide path, so that if you picked it up outside of East Mountain, you wouldn't run into East Mountain coming in. At any rate, staying on this glide path, if we try to do it with throttle alone, that's what we learned as student pilots. We pick an aim point, typically the 1,000-foot marker, or maybe the second center line on the runway after the threshold. If it was moving up the window, it meant we were going to land short, we'd add a little power. If it was moving down the window, we'd take a little power off. We control our speed with the pitch. If we were getting a little slow, we push the nose down. If we were getting a little slow, we push the nose down. We get a little fast, we pull the nose up. Certainly, admittedly, those two things are symbiotic. We cannot change one without changing the other. But the fact of the matter is, we were just looking for accuracy to land somewhere near that aim point. You know, practical tests, even for the accuracy landing, were allowed plus 200 feet. But when we are flying a glide path with vertical guidance in an LPV and an ILS, okay, the glide path is normally 1.4 degrees. I'm going to call it thick, meaning from deflection top, deflection bottom. If we were 10 miles from the touchdown point at the runway, this would represent a vertical distance of approximately 1,500 feet, narrowing down to just a few feet at touchdown. At the outer marker, each dot of the VDI equals approximately 50 feet. So that's out there at the final fix. Each dot on your VDI, when I say VDI, I'm talking about the glide path and the dots for the glide slope, okay? Each dot is equal to approximately 50 feet. At the middle marker, for those approaches where there are a middle marker, but that is also typically your decision altitude. That's typically the 200-foot DA. Each dot represents approximately, you ready for this, folks? 8 feet. 8 feet. The middle marker, as I said, is typically at a 200-foot DA. And from full scale to full scale on your VDI would be a total height of 80 feet. I defy anyone to maintain that kind of accuracy flying a glide path using the throttle. We use the elevator to stay on the glide path. We use the throttle to control the speed. And that's how we stabilize an approach. The last thing that I want to get into, and this applies to everyone, even if you are not an instrument rated pilot, and this has to do with recoveries from critical attitudes. And this is another area where I see bad instruction, okay? Every pilot on a practical test, whether it's sport pilot, well, sport pilot really doesn't have to do that, but private pilot, instrument pilot, commercial pilot has to do a recovery from a critical attitude, okay? And the ones that kill us typically are those spiral dives, okay? We have to remember that when we lose control, there's several reasons for it, but primarily an airplane does not have what we call spiral stability. Engineers have not yet figured it out. Cirrus has tried to do this by spring loading their controls. It helps a little bit, but it's not really all that great. And they know as pilots, we're not all that great. So they give us a level button, just push the button and it'll level off. There are many of us don't have the luxury of that button, okay? Let's think a moment what trim really does for us. What does trim really maintain? And everyone will say, oh, we use trim to relieve pressure on the control yoke. That's how we use it. But what it really maintains is an angle of attack. We've got four forces of flight going on: thrust, drag, lift, weight. In steady state flight, not necessarily level, but in steady state flight, those four forces are equal. Let's take level flight. Let's say that you're in your Skyhawk. Your power's set around 2,400 RPM. You're trimmed up for level. Thrust and drag have equaled out. Lift and weight have equaled out. And you're indicating 110. Let's just say 110 knots, okay? If we wanted to descend, if we just reduced our power, we've reduced the thrust, the nose would come down and we'd start to descend. However, we would not increase our airspeed because the drag would reduce as a result of the reduced thrust. This is why even in an airplane, a Bonanza is so wonderful this way, and many other airplanes with constant speed props will match the same kind of performance. If we're flying along, hand flying level, okay, and we're doing whatever our indicated airspeed is, if we reduce our power 1 inch, we will go into 100 foot per minute descent. Bonanzas are typically this way. So for every inch of power reduction, we will increase our descent rate by another 100 feet. Pull the power back 5 inches, there's a 500 foot minute descent rate, but it will stay at a constant speed, okay? However, getting back to the loss of control, that's fine. If the trim is there, it's going to maintain this airspeed, okay? However, when we bank the airplane, what force changes? And the answer is the load. We know that we increase G-force as we bank. And it's quite possible that the airplane, we're heads down doing something distracted, the airplane enters a bank and it starts to accelerate because with the loading, the angle of attack cannot maintain that airspeed. The load has increased, but the power is still right where it was and the lift is still there. So the airplane accelerates. Quite often the pilot doesn't recognize this until they come out of the bottom of the clouds, or perhaps in the clouds, look at their attitude indicator, look at their airspeed, freak out, say, yikes. And startle response says they're going to roll the wings level, quite often roll and pull. And that's when the tail and the wings leave the airplane. Even if they didn't pull, but just rolled, remember that trim was set to maintain 110 knots. The airplane now in a really developed spiral dive might very well be up at VNE or over. So you're doing somewhere around 170, 75, 180 knots. As soon as you roll those wings level, you have unloaded them and the airplane is going to pitch up drastically to try to get back to 110 knots, thereby losing all the pieces, parts that give you nice controlled flight. You become a lawn dart, and as we say, you can put your head between your knees and say goodbye. So let's look at the real recovery that I like to teach. For any of you who fly aerobatics, you probably know this as well. An aerobatic, when you're learning aerobatics, one of the first things you learn, if you lose control, the most important thing you need to do is unload the wings. So if you ever get into this situation, and unfortunately as instructors, we're never going to let you get that fast. We're never going to risk our lives that you're going to do the wrong thing. So we never let it get that fast. So you have to memorize this. Recoveries from a spiral dive where you're accelerating is power to idle to minimize the acceleration. Push, not push hard to go negative, but push as you roll to keep that airplane from pitching up violently. As the airspeed slows down to a normal speed, or even before you get quite to cruise, you can now allow the nose to come up, or perhaps even pull it up, and perhaps to add power. But remember, the important thing here is as you roll, push to keep the airplane from pitching up. So in summary, the things we've covered tonight have been the basics. We've talked about the basics of instrument attitude flying, control performance, primary supporting, things of that nature. We've also talked about situational awareness, where to look, when to look, what to see, and what to do predicated upon what you see. And we've talked about situational awareness. So that brings us to the close. We will open this up to questions, I believe. Glenn, that'll be up to you. I'm going to jump out of this in just a second and stop sharing the screen. But while I am here, I've mentioned several times the East Coast IFR experience. It is available through Community Aviation, and it's a special offer to all of you who have participated in this presentation. If you go to Community Aviation, you'll find my picture. It's prior COVID, so I don't have a beard, but click there. It'll take you to the East Coast IFR experience. If you want to purchase this, it'll ask for a coupon if you have one. Put in Turkey 50, and you will get a 33% discount on the purchase price of the East Coast IFR experience. So that's about it. I'm going to end the presentation, and Glenn, turn it back over to you.
Okay.
If we want to do questions, I'll be happy to do questions. I'll leave this up for just a little bit more.
All right. In order for questions, I guess the best way to do that is to put your question up on chat. And then I will read it off for Doug.
And I'll even put my ugly face up there.
There you go. I haven't seen anything. I will make a comment that I have the license, full license for Zoom, and it appears this session was limited to 100 people because I had some notes from a couple people who were trying to get in and I couldn't get them in. So I'm glad I recorded this. Actually, I'll stop the recording at this point.